Travel north o'er the Tay or east fae the Highlands and you enter Scotland's northeast. The Hale region fae the crags o' the Cairngorms, down the glens and straths o' the Esk, the Dee, the Don, the Devon, and into the heart o' Aberdeen itself is a unique airt with a rich heritage o' balladry, stories and music, castles, steam circles and distilleries. As you straveg the tunes, villages, streets and wynds, you'll hear folk speaking Scots. More specifically, North-East Scots, files kent by bynames sic as the Doric, Mearns, Toonser, Aberdeen and others.
Scots is the native Germanic vernacular of non-Gaelic Scotland and also of a few places in the north of Ireland. It is descended from Northumbrian dialects of various sorts which were brought into Scotland from the 7th until about the 12th century and have developed as the native varieties here in Scotland ever since. At the same time, a desire to kickstart a money economy meant that many noblemen from northern England and also from the Welsh Marches were invited north to set up a basically feudal system and also to set up protection for fortified markets, what we call boroughs.
These boroughs, or market towns, were part of a colonial process. For Gaelic rulers in the northeast were replaced by southern lairds, bringing Germanic language with them. The cathedrals were ta'en for the Gaelic heartlands, sic as Mortlach, and flitted to more controllable airts. An example is St Macher's Cathedral in Aberdeen. Eaton of the great boroughs was Aberdeen, so it's no surprise that the first serious work we hae in Scots was written here. In the 1300s, at St Macher's Cathedral, John Barber wrote the Bruce, the story of Robert the Bruce, the great Scottish king fa whommelt the English at Bannockburn. In all his lifetime he was in great pain, a great travail, and ne'er would for mischief fail, but drive the thing recht to the end, and tak the vray that God would send.
The Stewart period of Scottish history was not one of the happiest, but one thing that you can say about it was that it produced great artists of a variety of sorts. This included a number of the kings, King James I, King James IV, King James V, and Mary, Queen of Scots, all wrote poetry, Mary in French, Ellis in Scots. Her son James VI was also a writer of considerable ability. Surrounding these people, particularly the Jameses, were a group of artists, poets, musicians who would probably only have shone during that sort of time. James IV's court and James V's court in particular attracted people from all over Europe who were literary artists. But that didn't mean to say that they didn't look at home as well. So when we think of this golden age of Scottish writing, we think of it in terms of a range of people from a range of different parts of central and southern Scotland. Dunbar, we assume, from East Lothian, Henryson from Fife, Kennedy from southern Ayrshire, and so on. Writing in a wide range of styles, from the most ribald and indeed confusingly obscene ways to some of the most beautiful religious poetry, in my view, that has ever been written. And it tends to be the same person doing it. It's really when you get to people in the 16th century, like Gavin Douglas, that they actually make a distinction between what they call Southron and what they call Scottish, a term that was used before for Gaelic. So from that point of view, Scots as a reality, as a national language, probably existed before it was termed such.
There's twa parts to North East Scots, the features shared with other dialects of Scots and the features that are different or maybe unique, as Professor Smith and Professor Millar explain.
Lots of the shared features of Scots come from things that have been left over in Scots from the history of English more generally. So why is it that we say in Scotland oot and toon and roon and aboot and not out in town and round and about? Well, if you go way back about 500 years, you will find that throughout the United Kingdom, you hear folk saying oot and roon and a boot. So lots of the shared features we have are Fitwakan linguistics relic features for an older time. So in Scotland, we're further north, we're further away from Athen, we've held on to those particular sounds and structures that have maybe been lost in the rest of the country. So a lot of the shared features comes from this historical angle, the relic features.
North East Scots is a dialect of Scots which is difficult to define geographically. It's always difficult to tell when spoken dialects come into being. I suspect that from a very early period here in the North East, elements of what we now think of as the Doric or North East Scots were present. For instance, the change from wh to f was probably very quick because it's probably a Gaelic influence upon the language. We know that Gaelic remained for considerably longer here as a spoken language than elsewhere in Scotland or Scots-speaking Scotland. So therefore, from that point of view, it's not surprising there's a lot more Gaelic vocabulary, there's Gaelic influence in a variety of different places. I think you can look at it in this way. There is a central area, which is Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire up until about just to the west of Inverurie. And that area has the most maximally northeast features. So wh becomes f, and the equivalent of English moon is mean, and the equivalent of English school is squeal, and also the equivalent of English stone is steen. Right? Now, if you go to the west of there into Moray and Nairn, they have almost all of those, but stone is stain, as it is in most of Scotland. If you go into most of Kincardineshire, south of the mountains, and also Northern Angus, people say f for wh, but not when they're saying the equivalent to English white. They would say white, not fight. They also, some of them wouldn't say mean for moon, they would say men for moon, and scale for school. And under those circumstances, you're blending into the northern dialects of East Central Scots.
Scots was the national language of Scotland for centuries. Aberdeen Council did all their official business in Scots and left ahin many documents in the language, showing that a formal, official Scots was developing through the medieval period. For example, this wee agreement atween the Council and the Maester o' Kirk Work. The said day the Provost and Council aboon writing has chosen David Anderson and William Cooper under him and in his absence, Maesteress o' their kirk work for this instant. The Council doesn't do business in Scots the day, save at why his Scots fan sae far out of favour in civic and public life in the North East.
I suppose you can see three primary reasons why Scots ceased to have such a central literary national function within Scotland. The first of these is possibly the Protestant Reformation. It's certainly true to say that God stopped speaking Latin and started speaking English at the Reformation because there was no Scots Bible. Also, there is some evidence that suggests that Scottish Catholics were using Scots as a patriotic means of showing that the reformers were Anglophile. There's also the Union of Crowns of 1603, although I'm not convinced that that had a tremendous effect. Finally, you have the Scottish Parliament being shut down in 1707. Although Standard English was becoming the written form within the Parliament and within the justiciary, there's no doubt about the fact that having a centre, a political centre in Scotland encouraged a sense of Scottishness, which died out very quickly among many people of the middle classes with their concept of North Britain.
What is Scots? Scots is, as I said before, it's this wide, think of it as a continuum. And it's your classic, in linguistics, we talk about the Scots linguistic continuum. And at one end, you've got Scottish Standard English. And Scottish Standard English is, very simply put, English with a Scottish accent. That's probably how I'm sounding now. I've segged into my Scottish Standard English. And way at the other end of that continuum is Fitwaka Broad Scots, and now I've moved into my Broad Scots. And that differs fundamentally in sounds, structures, and words from English. So within that continuum, what you tend to find is you get folk at one end, folk at the other end, but a lot of folk can be both ends, and they can slide up and down that linguistic continuum, sounding mere Scottish Standard English or mere Broad Scots, just exactly as I've been doing now when I'm speaking.
This continuum is something that a Scots English bilinguals ken about, and its use is highly socially codified.
I hate it if you meet somebody that's English and somebody that's Scots, because I once had two poets stunning, well, twa Scots folk, Aberdonians at either side of us. One was Dr. Ken Morris, and he get to Robert Gordon's and was posh. And Robbie Shepherd was on the other side, and he get to Robert Gordon's, but he wasn't posh. And I just thought, can't say a word, because I didn't want Dr. Ken Morris thinking I was a gype, and I didn't want to Robbie Shepherd to think I was up myself, so I didn't say anything.
I'm for Buckie. I'm actually not quite for Buckie. I'm for the wee village outside Buckie. It's called Pertessie, but if you bide in Pertessie, nobody calls it Pertessie, you call it the Slough. Okay, so I'm for the Slough, and it's about, I think about 1,000 folk live in the Slough. And all my family live within about a half-mile radius of each other. They're all still up there. So I grew up in Buckie. I left when I was 18. My sister and brother were there till they were 18, or actually my sister was there until her 30s. So this is what we sounded like. And when I'm lecturing, I'm speaking like this in my more standard Scots voice. But when I go back to Buckie, I speak like this. And in fact, I could never go back speaking like this in my telephone voice, because people would be like, Fada vi thank you are, the Queen or something. So I definitely do a big switch when I go back to Buckie, and I speak in my home tongue.
Sheena Blackhall is one of the most important makers working in Scotland. Over the last umpteen years, she's worked through the reintroduction of North East Scots to the literary world, drawing upon both her own personal heritage and Scotland's literary heritage, including Burns, Charles Murray, J.C. Milne and Hugh MacDiarmid. What North East Scots actually is, changes and evolves. Change certainly doesn't mean death, and in fact is the sign of a living tongue.
Charles Murray is probably the first major name poet from the northeast of Scotland, concentrating largely on local concerns of rural northeast Scotland. After the First World War, many writers and other artists across Scotland, perhaps aware that they'd been fighting a war for Belgium, a small country, began to develop the idea of a new Scottish Renaissance. The most famous player in this is, of course, Hugh MacDiarmid. Now, it's difficult to compare Hugh MacDiarmid with Charles Murray because they were trying to do different things. Also, perhaps one was more talented than the other. Nonetheless, one of the less attractive features of the Renaissance, as perceived by Hugh MacDiarmid, was that dialect poetry, in any variety of Scots, was considered to be backward-looking, conservative and anti-Scottish. So you get into the situation when a very fine writer of Scots, Alexander Scott, writing in the period during and after the Second World War, who came from the northeast of Scotland, didn't write Northeast Scots, had in fact mocking references possibly to his own speech. I would say, in fact, that until we get to an artist of the calibre of Sheena Blackhall, who is in a sense an inheritor of both Murray and MacDiarmid, can we actually talk about a Doric Renaissance poet?
When I was a bairn, I learned Doric from my grandmother, and she had been at New Deer, but prior to that she was at Migvey. So my grandmother's Scots would have been a generation older than everybody else's, and given that my mother was 40 when I was born, and Granny was a fair age then, I'm speaking Doric that would have been used at the end, well, afore Queen Victoria did.
So 20 years ago, when I started doing this research, nobody used this term Doric. Folk in Buckie, that was an academic thing that posh folk down south used, right? And now it's almost been claimed. And when I go to Buckie now and talk to people, they're like, oh yeah, you see, I speak the Doric. And I'm like, so it's an interesting claiming of that word, but then people claim it in different ways, and what does it mean, etc. It's really interesting. Nobody used this term Doric 20 years ago. So and I think it's come from the media started talking about Doric, right? And it was picked up by locals rather than it starting ground up, it came top down. So when you look, if you take Doric to be a kind of big area in North East Scotland, your big isogloss, your big bubble covering quite a big part of the North East. And within that, you've got huge differences. So if you compare Moray Firth Doric, like Buckie, the Broch, for example, to someone like Deeside, they sound radically different. And perhaps one of the big differences, farming versus fisher. And you see that within even my own community in Buckie. If you listen to the farmers just 2 or 3 miles in land versus the fisher folk for the coast, they sound different.
And there's been a lot more movement in the North East than folk think. So folk just didn't abide. Apart from my family, which never seemed to leave, they get up to Coolin for 1623 and just leave his bed there, never left. But that's unusual. Most folk are wandering about all over the place. And it does affect language, of course it affects language. And now, of course, it's in the TV, so you find that it's seen as cool if you're Glasgow spoken. And you'll hear bairns in your class for Shetland, you'll hear them for Glasgow. So if what you're going to say to them, oh, I like your Scots, well, you can't expect mine, or that's, you know. There's perfectly legitimate to give that an airing as well.
We ken there's this thing that, and it's counterintuitive, but it's a fact, that language changes all the time. It's constantly moving tectonic plates all the time. There's no any language that stands still. So what we do in sociolinguistics is we compare generations of speakers. So your grannies, your mums and dads, and your parents, and we compare and contrast their speech. And when I've done that a lot in Buckie. You'll find, for example, that grannies will be saying fecht and racht and nacht, but the younger speakers, the bairns, will be saying fight and night and right.
It is always tempting with Scots to make up some kind of Jeremiad, that the next generation, who are of course a generation of vipers, are destroying our beautiful language by their watching YouTube and listening to popular music of one form or another. People have been saying that since the 18th century and it hasn't quite worked. I think we're at a crossroads with Scots today, which is that it will continue to be spoken, but by fewer and fewer people. Now, with the exception of the small dialects like the Black Isle, I won't see the end of any of the other dialects. But Scots, because it's a close relative of Standard English, is in the invidious position that gradually it can be subsumed into a colloquial form of English, and possibly we wouldn't notice all the time. Because the thing I notice going is not the pronunciation, and it's not necessarily the bits of grammar that we have different from English, it's the vocabulary. And without some kind of understanding of what's happening with that, which we don't really have as yet, we can't really see what's going to happen in the future for Scots.
Jo Gilbert is a poet who uses Scots as well as English to communicate her ideas, and an Aberdonian who uses Scots as well as English to communicate with her friends, colleagues and family.
I think using Doric is a little bit rebellious. I suppose I was looking at other performance poets and they've all kind of got, some of them have got a thing. And I thought, nobody else is doing that. Nobody else is doing the Doric thing. And I really liked the idea about writing about really contemporary, quite dark stuff. I've got a real hatred of nature poetry, just because it's so good and wholesome and no like real life, really, I mean, who spends their whole time running about going viewing herons and that's not how my life's been, that's not how I was brought up. I come from a working class family. So I think there is a bit of rebellion in there where I wanted to ruffle some feathers. I think Doric is a medium for the future, but we need to start doing something about it now. It is still a living language, it's nae dying out, but the majority of folk that speak it are aller. I think the Shire are doing quite a lot in terms of education, that they're making it part of their curriculum, and there's wee bits happening now in the city as well. And so when folk were asking me at the beginning, I told them that I was using bastardised Doric because it's half Teuchter and half Tunser. I would use words that are purely Aberdonian, but there are other words that have come from the other side of my family heritage that I will use, like puddick, or a puckly a neeps, or bachels, or, words that I know, but there's plenty of Doric words that I read and I think, why didn't I ken that? But it's because I've no heard it. I think, my kind of interpretation of the language has been fit I've heard, so that comes for the folk that speak it. To be fair, I've only just started engaging with written Doric. A lot of it has been about spoken words rather than, which has probably attracted me to the performance element of it as well.
Out in the Shire, the situation is gae different. Statistically, mair folk are Scots speakers, with peaks in tunes sick as Banff. A progressive attitude is apparent in education and wider civic life. A thing the Shire is blessed with is folk willing to fecht for the mother tongue. Top-down initiatives, such as the SQA Scots Language Award, the North East Scots Language Board, schools around the North East teaching Scots, and Aberdeenshire Council's Scots Language Policy are helping gie North East Scots the status it needs. But there can be resistance to official intervention, as well as negative impacts.
Well, I was brought up outside Portsoy, so out in the country. I was a country loon, so it was kind of brought up around that kind of Doric speaking tongue. But where I was told, well, Mum, Dad spoke Doric, Granny, Granda, especially Granda, he spoke Doric kind of thing. But when you get out the door to go to school, I had to change back to your English tongue, so to say, kind of thing. But round about the house, it was just you would be using your Doric phrases and stuff like that. And when you went up to Granny's for your lunch or your supper or whatever, it'd be the same. So it's fine to get to speak it at home, but when you go to school, it was kind of frowned upon almost.
In terms of the younger speakers in Buckie now, are they approaching the dialect in a different way, or are they learning it like I learned it at home? I think for sure they are learning it at home. We know a language, that's where you learn it, in the home in the first few years of life. And it's nae different with a dialect. And this idea that, you might learn it in school with somebody telling you the rules of it, actually it's something that comes much, much more naturally to you. So when you're in the home, your mum's nae saying to you, well, in standard Scottish English we say out, but in Buckie, you can say oot. They're nae telling you those things. They're nae teaching you the rules, just like you learn the rules of the verb to be in French, je suis, tu es. They're nae teaching you like that. It comes very, very naturally to us.
The bairns come through the corridor speaking Doric. You hear Doric in the corridors, you hear Doric on the play parks, the sports parks, you hear Doric in the dinner queues. You hear Doric away around about the school. My estimation is roughly between 50 and 60% of folk are Doric speakers and probably will be speaking Doric at home.
Who do you speak Doric? I would say that it's starting to pick up now because folk are realising that it's being accepted, or widen round my thing. I would say that it's the speaking in the Doric of the young folk nowadays is starting to become more common because of the new awards and everything like that. Everybody's realising that they can actually get something out of it, rather than just getting a clout out of the lug kind of thing for speaking it. But no, it's definitely becoming more popular now, especially with texting. Obviously, technology's taken over, and I would definitely say that if you read some of the texts around about here, it is mainly in Doric kind of thing, without folk even kenning it, that they're doing it.
We've been teaching Scots here for about 4 years. We've been doing the SQA award, as well as teaching it to junior bairns as part of their Scottish Studies first year. The SQA award, it's seen about 15, 20 awards that the SQA have brought in, apart from the Highers and National, slightly different, to try and pick up on broader achievement through the school, give bairns an opportunity to study other things and to get points as well towards their qualifications. We've had about 70 kids through the Scots Language Award from 2014. Started with 7 bairns and we've moved on to classes of about 20. So 70 through it, plus we've had about 1,000 bairns engaging with Scots Language throughout their schooling. First and second year we have Scottish Studies and we have a unit on Doric as well.
The consensus seems to be that the only way for it is to make sure that North East Scots is healthy at the grassroots, being learnt at home and in the community. We support for the schools and for wider officialdom. A raising of status is essential.
In Shetland, there's been for decades now a big movement towards the dialect. They have dialect groups, it's taught in schools, etc. What's happening in Shetland? Certainly in Lerwick, it's wipeout. When you hear the younger speakers, and that's what our paper shows that we looked at in Shetland, when you hear the younger speakers, a lot of them are losing the dialect. They're sounding more like that Scottish Standard English. Now, Bucky, nobody speaks about the dialect, or it's nae a thing, right? They just do it. And when you look, yeah, there are changes. The younger speakers are not saying fecht and nach, they're saying fight and right. But the younger speakers 100% of the time are saying fit far fan and that book's there, etc. So it's a really interesting thing of we think there's a tension between fit comes for the grassroots and how that works and what comes with, because here we're really talking about, the question you're asking is top-down pressures, how does that work? And I'm not quite sure. I'm really not quite sure. And what I really am not so keen on doing is me as an academic going and telling folk that they should do. I'm not sure that works, right? And I'm not sure it's the right thing to do.
Here at the Elphinstone Institute, we support the learning of North East Scots across a wide age range, from bairnhood to retirement and beyond, but mair needs doing. We'll give the last word for now to Professor Robert Millar of Aberdeen Varsity.
In the 2011 census, we were told that 1.5 million people spoke Scots. This is probably something of an understatement. It possibly is 2 million, although it would be very difficult to prove this. The reason I say this is because it's almost inevitable on the first time that a question is asked that people will misunderstand what they're being asked about. Undoubtedly, in a country with just a bit over 5 million people living in it, having almost a half of them speaking a language which has practically no official status does make you think, because it's pretty rare in the world to see something like that. And when it has happened, as in Luxembourg in the 1970s and 1980s, something was done about it. When you look at the North East and also other heartlands of Scots like Shetland, you see that the number of people who said they were Scots speakers was close to 50% or higher in the case of Shetland. This tells you something as well. People are very aware of what they speak, and they also consider it to be part of their identity. If that's the case, and I think you have to accept that, then something seriously has to be done about Scots all over Scotland, but particularly here in the northeast, because it would truly be a national tragedy if people's native language was at best ignored and at worst allowed to die. On discussions of Arthurian legend, I've been on occasion guilty of saying that Scots is a once and future language. What I mean by that is that there was a time when Scots was a national language, heading towards language standardisation. It is quite possible to imagine an alternative history where Scotland maintained not only its independence, but its own sense of self culturally, which is probably more important for this. And moving forward from that, had a language just like Norway has a language, and just like Luxembourg has got a language, and so on. Not spoken by many people, but that's not our problem. Future is up to us. That's the difference. Scots is a language linguistically in some ways because it isn't mutually intelligible in its densest form with Standard English. But in other ways it's like a dialect because it has been dialectalised under Standard English. We don't generally write in Scots unless there's a specific reason for doing so. If we could get round that, if we could get to the situation where Scots was given equality to English in schools, then it would be a present language again.